It's on.
So Boker Tov, everybody, or Erev Tov, depending upon where you are. Welcome to Knesset Israel Torah Center Torah Learning Experience on Sunday. And this shiur is devoted to the elevation of the soul. Bob Gittleman, who is a very beloved member of the Sacramento Jewish community of Knesset Israel Torah Center, who owned a kosher delicatessen and grocery store in Sacramento for quite a few years, which was an amazing resource and always with a smile and charm, him and his family. And he passed away just this last week, and he will be sorely missed. Okay, we're going to now dig in to a really fascinating issue, and that is the strange nature of the last 8 verses of the Torah. The last 8 verses of the Torah describe the death of Moshe in real time. Let's look at a passage in the Talmud which notices this problem and tries to solve the problem in 2 different ways. Read it in Hebrew. It was taught in a tradition coming from the time of the Mishnah, Vayamot Sham Moshe Eved, that Moshe, the servant of the Lord, died there. That's the 8th to the last verse. And then the subsequent verses describe his death and the aftermath. So the Talmud asks a very obvious question.
Oops, sorry. Sorry, that was my fault.
Is it possible? I'm back.
Yeah, you're back. I tried to mute because we're getting a lot of noise. So most people have muted. So now go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah.
My
okay,
fault.
Great. So the Talmud asks, Efshar Moshe mate, is it possible that Moshe died? V'katav v'yamot sham Moshe, and yet he's writing the words, and Moshe died there. If he's dead, how could he be describing an event that happened when he's dead, right? So that sounds impossible. Ella adkan katav Moshe. So how can we explain this? So the Talmud suggests that up to the last 8 verses in the Torah, Moshe wrote those passages all the way from in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth until, but not including, and Moshe died there. Ve'elach katav Yehoshua. And from that point on, meaning the last 8 verses, which describe Moshe's death and the aftermath of Moshe's death, so katav Yehoshua. Yehoshua wrote those. Joshua wrote those 8 psukim, those 8 verses. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. These are the words of Rabbi Yehuda. V'amrei la Rabbi Nechemiah, some people say, is a different rabbi, Rabbi Nechemiah. Amar le Rabbi Shimon. So Rabbi Shimon responded to Rabbi Yehuda. Now this is a very auspicious timing here, because this Rabbi Shimon is none other than Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And this week, of course, is Lag BaOmer, which is the traditional yard site of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who has this aura of being this great mystic, and you're going to definitely see that personality come out today, Rabbi Shimon responds to the suggestion of Rabbi Yehuda that Yehoshua, in fact, wrote the last 8 psukim. He says the following: it's impossible. It's impossible to say that Yehoshua wrote the last 8 psukim. Why? Efshar Sefer Torah chaser ot echat. Is it possible that you would have a book of the Torah, a Sefer Torah, and it would lack even 1 letter? 1 letter's missing. The Sofer made a mistake. He left out 1 letter. That happens to be not a Sefer Torah. It's a book, but it's not a Sefer Torah. Sefer Torah has to have every single letter and every single word. Uchtiv, and we know that the Torah describes the Sefer Torah as it exists before Moshe died. And it says regarding that Sefer Torah which existed in Moshe's own lifetime, Lakol et Sefer Torah zeh, take this Sefer Torah. So if we have this verse during Moshe's own lifetime, which refers to Sefer HaTorah, which means it must be a kosher Sefer Torah with all the words of the Sefer Torah, including the last 8 psukim. It must be those last 8 psukim existed even in Moshe's lifetime. It couldn't have been that the last 8 psukim were added after Moshe died. That's the argument of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So wait a second. So how do I explain how Moshe could have written those last 8 psukim? Ella Ad Kan. He has a different explanation. Up to the last 8 psukim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu Omer. So Hashem spoke, he dictated. Moshe Omer V'chotev. And Moshe spoke and wrote. Now I just want to point out, this is going to become important in a few minutes. The text of our Talmud right now is a little bit strange. It's describing how all of the Torah came into being up to, but not including the last 8 psukim. And the version of the Talmud that we have in front of us says that God spoke, he dictated, and Moshe Omer V'chotev, and Moshe spoke and wrote. It would have been a lot more simple if the language would have been God spoke, he dictated, and Moshe wrote up to the last 8 psukim. So this notion of Moshe spoke and wrote, why the extra speaking? Moshe spoke and wrote. So that's problematic. We'll talk about that later. Mikan ve'elach. And with regards to the last 8 psukim, how did they come into being if Yehoshua didn't write them? HaKadosh Baruch Hu Omer, God spoke, Moshe kotev b'dema. And Moshe wrote them, doesn't say speaking, he just wrote them b'dema, with tears. Kamoshe ne'emar lahalan, as we see this notion of taking dictation with regards to the relationship between the prophet Yirmiyahu and his scribe Baruch, where it says, Vayomer lehem Baruch mipiv yikra elai, that Yirmiyahu would call to me from his mouth, he would say the words to me, he would dictate, and kol devrim ha'ela, all of these things, va'ani kotev ala sefer b'dio, and I would write it down. So God dictated to Moshe the last 8 psukim, and Moshe wrote them down, but he wrote them down with tears. What does that mean, he wrote them down with tears? So we'll see a lot of different explanations, but right now it sounds like the simplest explanation might be it's describing his own death, and there's something upsetting about that. So God dictated those last 8 psukim, Moshe wrote them down while crying. So now the Talmud points out that this is not just a theoretical question about who wrote down the last 8 psukim. Let's review. According to the view of Rabbi Yehuda, Yehoshua wrote down those last 8 psukim. And according to the view of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Moshe wrote them down, but he wrote them down with tears. So the Talmud says there's actually a practical implication. It's not just theoretical. What's the practical implication of this? You're going to find out right now. Kiman az lahad amar Rabbi Yehoshua bar Abba, amar Rav Gido, amar Rav. So the Talmud says that we have a halacha, we have a law that was conveyed by a teacher named Rav in the Talmud, and that law is the following. Shmona psukim shebetorah. The last 8 psukim of the Torah, there's a special status that they have. And what's that special status? Yachid korei otan. An individual reads them. An individual reads them. Now, the Talmud wants to know, does that reflect, we don't know what that means, by the way, you'll see in a second. It's not clear what it means that the last 8 psukim and the individual reads them, talking about how the Torah is read in the synagogue. So we don't know what exactly that means yet, but somehow they have some special unique status that Yachid Korei Otan, only an individual reads them. Does this go according to the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua or Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai? So the Talmud says at first glance, it sounds like name of Rabbi Yehuda. It sounds like it's the view of Rabbi Yehuda that in fact Yehoshua wrote them. They have a whole separate status because Moshe didn't write them. Yehoshua wrote them. That's why Yachid Korei Otan, an individual reads those last 8 psukim. Deloka Rabbi Shimon, and not like Rabbi Shimon who says, no, Moshe wrote the entire Torah, even the last psukim, except the last 8 psukim he wrote with tears. Afilu Tema Rabbi Shimon. You actually don't have to say that, the Talmud says. It could even reflect the view of Rabbi Shimon, who said that Moshe wrote the entire Torah, though the last 8 psukim in tears. Why could it reflect the view of Rabbi Shimon, Bar Yochai? Ho v'ishtanei, ishtanei. It's because since the last 8 psukim, last 8 verses are different in some manner, that is, that according to the view of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, they were written with tears, So that gives them a different status. It doesn't have to be so dramatic that Yehoshua wrote them to give them a different status. Even the fact that Moshe wrote them in a different way, he wrote them with tears, gives them a different status. And that status is reflected by a practical halacha, which we don't know what it means, that Yachid Koreh Otan, an individual, one person reads them, whatever that means. Okay. So now what I want to do is take a look at a very interesting commentary of the Ritva, one of the medieval commentators. And he points out that there are two different versions of the passage in the Talmud that we just read. And the difference is very slight, but meaningful. The version that we just went through ourselves said that up to the last 8 verses, God spoke, meaning he dictated the words, and Moshe spoke and wrote. That's the version we have of the Talmud. But the Ritva says that he knows of a different text. There was an alternative text of the Talmud floating around that was slightly different, actually simpler. And it says that all of the Torah up to the last 8 verses, God spoke and Moshe wrote. Not Moshe spoke and wrote. What's that extra spoke? Moshe spoke and wrote, right? And the last 8 verses, then Moshe wrote with tears. So the Ritva cites these two different versions of the Talmud and explains that difference between the two versions. And he says the following. You can follow along in the English as I read in the Hebrew. Yesh gorsin hakadosh baruch hu omer Moshe kotev. Some people have the text that says the following, that up to the last 8 verses, that Hashem would speak Moshe kotev, and Moshe would write it down. Not Moshe was spoken right down, but Moshe heard the dictation and he wrote it down. Mikan ve'elach, and from then on, HaKadosh Baruch Hu omer Moshe kotev b'dema. From then on, HaKadosh Baruch Hu spoke the last 8 psukim, and Moshe wrote with tears. Now the Ritva explains, according to that version of the Talmud, which is not the version we have. The version we have is God spoke and Moshe spoke and wrote. So according to the version that says God spoke and Moshe wrote, what does that mean? Perush v'hafresh benehem. What's the difference between all of the Torah up to the last 8 verses and the last 8 verses? Ki harishonim nichtavu b'diyo. It means the following, that the all of the Torah, except for the last 8 verses, God spoke and Moshe wrote. He wrote it in the normal way. Ki harishonim nichtavim b'diyo. They were written down with ink. God spoke, Moshe wrote. V'achronim nichtavim b'dema. And the last 8 verses, it's Moshe, God spoke, and Moshe wrote with tears. So the Ritva explains, what does it mean with tears? Doesn't mean he was crying. It means that instead of using ink, Moshe used tears. They were written with tears instead of ink. That's the difference between the first part of the Torah and the last 8 verses. Because of, it doesn't say concerning the first part of the Torah that God spoke and Moshe spoke and wrote. It just says the first part, God spoke and Moshe wrote. And the difference is that the last 8 verses, God spoke and Moshe wrote with tears. Meaning, what was the substrate or the material that God used to write down the Torah? Was it ink or tears? But what about our version of the Talmud, which says the first part of the Torah, God spoke and Moshe spoke and wrote. The last 8 verses, God spoke and Moshe wrote b'dema, with tears. What does that mean? Some people have the text, which is our text, that up to the last 8 verses, that God spoke and Moshe omer v'kotev, Moshe spoke and wrote. What does that mean? Klomar, the Ritva explains, shahaya chozer hapasuk. When it says that God spoke and the Moshe spoke and wrote, that Moshe would repeat the verse, kodem sheyichteveno, before he would write it down. That's what it means, God spoke and Moshe spoke and wrote. He'd repeat the verse. Why? Mirov chiba, out of his great love for the words of the Torah. Ukadei shelo yiteban, so he should make a mistake. So he'd repeat the verse God would say the verse, Moshe would repeat the verse. Omer v'kotev, he would speak it, he'd repeat it to make sure that he got it right and as an expression of love. Mikan ve'elach. Now, what about the last 8 verses? What's different about those last 8 verses? HaKadosh Baruch Hu Omer. So God would speak, u'Moshe kotev b'dema, and Moshe would write b'dema. He wrote it with tears. Klomar shaya kotev u'bocher. So that, in fact, the Ritva says, according to this explanation, that he wrote it while crying. V'lo haya chozer, but he didn't repeat the verses, right? Only up to the last 8 verses, it says God spoke and Moshe spoke, repeat the verse and wrote. The last 8 verses, God spoke and Moshe then wrote, but he didn't repeat. Why not? Because he was choked up crying. V'lo haya chozer pasuk mirov tzar, he didn't repeat the verse because he was all choked up. Okay, that's the explanation of the Ritva based upon the 2 different versions of the Talmud. Now, for the rest of our discussion tonight, we're going just to assume the version of the Talmud that we have, which is the second version that the Ritva explains. Then the way he explained it is, just to repeat, that up to the last 8 psukim, God spoke, Moshe repeated, and then wrote down. The last 8 verses, God spoke, and Moshe couldn't repeat because he was crying. He was all choked up. Okay, now what I want to do is try to understand this practical halacha that the Talmud mentions as a reflection of this idea that there's something special about those last 8 verses. Either Moshe wrote them while crying, he couldn't repeat them, like the Ritva explained, or according to the view of Rabbi Yehuda, that in fact Yehoshua wrote those last 8 verses, that special status of the last 8 verses reflected by this halacha of Yachid Korei Otam, that an individual reads them. What does that mean? An individual reads them. There's some practical halacha, it's in Shulchan Aruch. What does it mean? Individual reads them. So let's, maybe to prevent confusion, we're going to now take a look at some of the ways to explain the halacha. We're going to see something amazing. For those of you who are not so familiar with Talmud and Talmudic commentary, one of the remarkable things is that you have this rather cryptic halacha that regards to the last 8 verses, Yachid Korei Otam, that an individual reads them, or one person reads them. You're going to see now an unbelievable spectrum of attempts at understanding what those few words mean. This is a practical halacha, and we're going to have about 8 different explanations. If you have 8 different explanations, what that little phrase means, Yachid Korei Otam. The last 8 verses, an individual, one person reads them, and 8 different explanations. That means nobody really knows what that phrase means. Let's take a look at this work, Shita Mekubetzet, and he quotes a Rimigash who says the following. The last 8 verses of the Torah must be read in the synagogue service by one person. That's the halacha in the Talmud. What does that mean? That is to say, he who reads the verses before them is not allowed to finish off to the end of the Torah, since he would be reading that which Moses wrote with that which Yehoshua wrote, meaning that the person who's reading the Torah, the Balkorei, that when he's reading the end of the Torah, he must stop at the end, right up to the last 8 verses, but stop there, not continue and read together the last 8 verses with what came before it. He has to stop. And then somebody else should read the last 8 verses. Why? It's because he shouldn't be mixing together that which Moshe wrote and that which Yehoshua wrote. He should rather stop, and another person should come up and read the final verses by themselves, so that it be recognizable that Moshe did not write them, but Yehoshua. So according to this explanation, that there's a special status to those last 8 verses, and the Rimigash is quoting the view of Rabbi Yehuda that Yehoshua wrote those last 8 verses, that uniqueness of the last 8 verses, that there's somehow, it's sort of implied on some level inferior perhaps, that therefore you have to have one Balkorei read up to, but not including the last 8 verses, and then separate it out to make it clear that this is not now Mosaic Torah. This is Joshua Torah. I was talking to somebody who actually said it in a nice way, that in a certain sense, perhaps according to this view, you could regard the last 8 verses of the Torah as the beginning of the book of Joshua, right? The next book of Tanakh after the 5 books of Moses is the book of Joshua. In a certain sense, the last 8 verses of the Torah, the beginning of the book of Yehoshua. So we make that distinction by having somebody else read those last 8 verses. That's what it means. One person read them, meaning another person, right? One person, not the person who read the Torah beforehand. So then he quotes another opinion, the exact opposite. And an alternative explanation of they should be read by one person. That is to say, the Baal Koreh is not allowed to stop at these last 8 verses in order that it should not be noticed that Joshua wrote them, right? The exact opposite. That when you have a Baal Koreh who's reading the passages before the last 8 verses, he cannot stop at those last 8 verses. He has to keep reading all the way to the end of the Torah so that we'll view that as all one unified part of the Torah and not notice that, oh, this Mosaic Torah, as it were, up to the last 8 verses. And the last 8 verses, that's Joshua Torah. So to make sure that people don't make that distinction, Yachid Koreotan, have one person read up to the last 8 verses and continue through those last 8 verses to the end of the Torah. Okay, so that's the 2 views quoted by Shita Mekubetzet. Now, Rashi is the most famous commentator on the Torah. How does he explain this passage? So he says the following, a different explanation. What does it mean that those last 8 verses should be read by one person? One person should read all of the last verses and not stop in the middle to allow another person to read. So he says the following, different explanation. He says that the Baal Koreh, the person reading the Torah, who's ever reading those last 8 verses, must read all 8 verses and not subdivide them. What's he talking about here? So let's say at Knesset Israel Torah Center in Sacramento, California, that there's a bar mitzvah and we want to give honor to more people. You can add aliyot. So we could theoretically take those last 8 verses in the Torah, we could subdivide them into 2 aliyot of 4 and 4. So Rashi says, wow, that's permissible in other passages of the Torah. When it comes to the last 8 psukim, one is not allowed to subdivide those last 8 psukim, and they have to be read all together by whoever the Baal Koreh is. You cannot subdivide the last 8 psukim. That's the third explanation. So Tosfot offers a different explanation. What does it mean they should be read by one person? Rabbeinu Meshulam explains that this excludes the Torah reader from reading with them. What does that mean? So as everybody's familiar with, when we have an aliyah to the Torah, so there is a Baal Koreh, he reads from the Torah, and a person gets the honor of the aliyah, who makes the blessings before the reading, follows along quietly with the reading, and makes the after blessing after the reading. But in ancient times, it was not done this way. There was no such thing as a Baal Koreh. If you were called up for an aliyah to the Torah, you also had to read it. As a matter of fact, Yemenite Jewry, till this very day, that's the way it's done. There's no Baal Koreh. If you receive an aliyah to the Torah, you also have to read from the Torah. That is why I studiously avoid the Yemenite minyan in Alon Shvut, because since I'm a Levi, I often get called up to the Torah. And if I'm called up in the Yemenite synagogue, I'm going to have to show my abysmal Torah reading skills for the whole world to see. So I make sure I don't have anywhere near the Yemenite synagogue in Alon Shvut. So Rebbe Shalom explains that the last 8 psukim, you're not allowed to have a Baal Koreh. You have to make sure that whoever's called up to read the last 8 psukim is a Yemenite, and so he will read all the last 8 psukim himself. So Rabbeinu Tam, who's this is part of Tosfot, the Tosfot quotes Rabbeinu Tam, one of the greatest personalities in the time of the Balei Tosfot, right after the generation of Rashi. This is problematic to Rabbeinu Tam. It makes no sense, he said, this explanation. Since the days of the sages in the Talmud, there was no assistance from a Torah. There was no such thing as a Baal Koreh in the time of the Talmud. So it doesn't make sense that there's a halakha that says you can always use a Balkore to read the Torah for you, but when it comes to the last 8 psukim, you can't use a Balkore. You have to read it yourself. So that cannot possibly be the explanation here, because after all, there was no such thing as a Balkore in the time of the Talmud. So explains Tosfot. Okay, so that's another explanation. The Rambam. So the Rambam gives another, actually sort of shocking explanation. The Rambam says the following: the 8 verses at the conclusion of the Torah may be read in a synagogue when fewer than 10 people are present. They are indeed all Torah and were related by Moses from the Almighty. However, since on the surface they appear to have been recited after Moses' death, they are different. Therefore, it is permissible for an individual to read them. So the Rambam explains the following: that the last 8 psukim of the Torah, they can be read without a minyan. Amazing idea. This sort of reflects us on some level, this idea that there's somehow some lesser degree of sanctity of the last 8 psukim, even though he says that in fact all of those psukim were given by Moshe from the Almighty, but since, at least from a literary point of view, they seem to reflect the idea that they were given after Moshe's death, therefore they're treated differently, and therefore an individual can read them, meaning you don't need a minyan. Okay, so by the way, for shuls that are a little bit scared of having a women's Torah reading, those last 8 psukim, according to Rambam, would be a good opportunity to have a women's Torah reading, since you don't need a minyan, according to Rambam, to read those last 8 psukim. Okay. Now, we're not done. There's another explanation. The Mordechai. The Mordechai says it means one person reads them. He says, I heard one person means a Torah scholar, meaning not one, but in the sense of singular. A singular person reads those last 8 psukim. And I heard a nice idea that said our custom now, which is to honor a prominent person in the synagogue with the honor of finishing off the Torah, the last part of the Torah, that we call Chatan Torah. So that honor may be based upon the Mordechai's explanation of this halakha, that Yachid Koreotan, a singular person, a Torah scholar, should read those last 8 psukim. So this is a very different approach. We're saying that those last 8 psukim have a special, unique status, even perhaps an elevated status, and therefore you call a very prominent person in the synagogue, Torah scholar, read those last 8 psukim. Now, we had so many explanations now about what that small phrase is, this halakha, which reflects the unique status of the last 8 psukim. And I'd like to know how the Shulchan Aruch rules on this particular issue. So let's read the Shulchan Aruch, and I'm going to ask somebody, I'll stop talking for a second, and ask somebody out there in digital space to tell me which view the author of the Shulchan Aruch accepted. So the Shulchan Aruch says the following: the last 8 verses in the Torah, we do not interrupt them. Rather, one person reads them all. Can anybody guess which view that is? Is it Tosfot, Mordechai, Rambam, Rashi? Any speculation?
And you can unmute yourselves.
Who would like to guess? Shulchan Aruch's view
like
is reflecting which understanding?
Would be the, I believe the Rambam.
The Rambam? So the Rambam said the last 8 verses in the Torah are unique because we don't need a minyan.
But it's still
So I'm
read.
not sure I see that in the Shulchan Aruch. Doesn't mention minyan or not minyan.
Rashi
He says,
you read the whole thing.
who said Rashi?
I did.
Whoever said Rashi,
I did.
get, that was excellent. You get free Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur tickets to Knesset Israel Torah Center.
Awesome.
I'm not sure it was my role to give those out, but that was 100% right. That's the view of Rashi, right?
Rashi's the one that said the same person reads the whole thing.
Exactly. You're not allowed to subdivide the last 8 verses. And let's take a look at the famous commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, the Mishnah Berurah, and he explains that we do not interrupt them to divide them into 2 readers. The reason is, since they are different from the rest of the Torah, as Joshua wrote them, right, according to the view of Rabbi Yehuda, even according to the opinion that Moses wrote them with tears, but since they're different, being written with tears, like the Ritva explains, they are treated differently to not subdivide them like the rest of the Torah. Fine. Okay. So what we've seen so far, let's just do a quick review, is those last 8 psukim are problematic because they are describing an event which Moshe could not possibly have witnessed, and that is his own death. So how could he have written them? So Rabbi Yehuda says, you're right, Yehoshua wrote them. And Yehoshua wrote them. And according to the view of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, no, Moshe wrote them, but he wrote them with tears. Okay? And whether that means while crying or with the substrate of tears instead of ink, right? That depends upon the version of the Talmud, whether Moshe spoke and wrote or just wrote, as we described above. Okay, now the whole world's going to change.
Could I add a quick comment, or do you want me to?
Yeah, please.
There's several ways to look at this, and there's so much machlokas that I don't think that my opinion is necessarily an addition. But first, the Torah was written before Bria, and even Kabbalah says Hashem looked into the Torah. So the whole Torah was completed. And in terms of saying before writing, it says in Yeshiva's teaching that you have to repeat something 3 times to remember it. And so probably that's the source of people having to repeat before they could write down something that's in stone, essentially. And the crying and the crying might be related to the fact that Hashem told him for the very last time, you're not going into the land, but you can look at it from above. And so,
so everything you said is very nice, as a matter of fact. It's not clear exactly why, if according to the opinion said he was crying, not that he wrote with tears, it's not clear exactly what he was crying about. Was he crying because of coming to face with his own mortality? So maybe not. Maybe it's because he was crying because he was not going to enter Eretz Israel. As we know that in Parshat Vet Hanan, even though Moshe knew very far in advance he was not going to enter into Eretz Israel, he pleads at the end of his life, please Hashem, relent, let me go into Eretz Israel. Please give me clemency, let me go into Eretz Israel. And God says no. So it could be that's the source of his crying. And I like what you said about the idea of repeating. That helps us to remember. As a matter of fact, there's even a halacha that says you're supposed to go over the Torah portion each week, reading each verse twice and reading the Aramaic translation once. So perhaps that's derived from this passage that even Moshe repeated each verse after God dictated to him. And then you also had mentioned this idea of the Torah preceding the creation of the world and something about mysticism. So you're going to see right now, that's exactly where we're going. So put in your seatbelts. Everything up to now has been straightforward in a Talmudic sense, but now we're going to get kabbalistic. In order to understand an amazing explanation of the Vilna Gaon, of this passage in the Talmud, we first have to learn a Rambam, a very famous comment of Nachmanides. And he's explaining the nature of the Torah. He says the following: we have yet another mystic tradition that the whole Torah is comprised of names of the Holy One, blessed be He, and that the letters of the words separate themselves into divine names when divided in a different manner. As you may imagine, by way of example, that the verse of Breshit divides itself into these other words, Beroshit Barei Elokim, instead of Breshit Bara Elokim. This principle applies to the entire Torah, aside from the combinations and numerical equivalents of the holy names. So let's just step back for a second. The Ramban is suggesting here, a mystic tradition, that the Torah as we possess it is not the original Torah. There was a primordial Torah, a mystical Torah, a precursor Torah. And that precursor Torah is comprised of the mystical names of God. And that primordial, precursor, mystical Torah was a string of letters with no spaces. It's almost like computer code. a long series of letters without spaces, and those letters conveyed the different names of God. Let's read on a little bit, and then I'll return to what perhaps this mystical idea is trying to say. It is for this reason that a scroll of the Torah in which a mistake has been made in one letter's being added or subtracted is disqualified, even though the literal meaning remains unchanged. For instance, as some of you may know, you could write, I'll give you a simple example, the word shomer, guard. The word shomer can be written with 4 letters, shin, vav, mem, resh, and the vav indicating the O sound, shomer. You could also write that same word without the vav, shin, mem, resh. How do you know how to pronounce it? You know how to pronounce it by looking in a printed chumash that has the vowels. In the Torah scroll itself, there are no vowels indicated. And the reason we know how to pronounce it, the way we know how to pronounce it, is based upon a printed chumash or a tikkun, the special chumash that Torah readers use to prepare reading for the Torah. But so shin, vav, mem, resh, or shin, mem, resh mean exactly the same thing if you pronounce it shomer, and each one could be pronounced shomer. Yet, if a scribe were to make a mistake, and let's say the word shomer was supposed to be written shin, vav, mem, resh, and he by accident left off the vav, it wouldn't matter in terms of the meaning. You're still going to pronounce it shomer, but the halacha is the Torah is disqualified. It's not kosher. Why? He says the only way to understand this, since it's not changing the meaning, what's the problem? He says, because of this mystical idea that the whole Torah comprises names of the Holy and Blessed be He, obligates us to disqualify a scroll of the Torah in which one letter, vav, is missing from the word otam. He gives a different example than I gave. Why? Because since every letter in the Torah originally was part of a primeval Torah, a primordial Torah, a precursor Torah, a mystical Torah, which was mystically spelling out different names of God without any spaces demarcating words as we have it nowadays, that vav was highly significant. Now, don't ask me personally what the significance was. I don't know. But for those who know the kabbalistic secrets, that vav was an essential part of this computer code, of this primal Torah, which is expressive of God's names. And then he says that a famous tradition might be reflecting this mystical idea. And that is, it would appear that the Torah was written with letters of black fire upon a background of white fire. This is a Talmuidc tradition. What does that mean? The Torah is written with black fire upon a background of white fire? That this is a reference to the primeval Torah, the precursor Torah, the mystical Torah. That was this form we have mentioned, namely that the writing was contiguous without break of words, which made it possible for it to be read by way of divine names, and also by way of our normal reading, which makes explicit Torah and the commandments. That is, you would have to then divide it up and to make it the normative Torah as we have it nowadays, as he goes on to say. It was given to Moses, our teacher, using the division of words. The way we have the Torah nowadays is we'll call it the normative Torah, not mystical Torah, where you have divisions of words, which expresses the commandments and the narrative. And orally, it was transmitted to him in the rendition, which consists of the divine names. So Moshe received orally the mystical Torah, but then he wrote down the normative Torah, where it's divided into discrete words, sentences, so that it can convey in a language that we can understand narrative and mitzvot in the commandments. Okay, I want to just explore this idea of Ramban for a second, and then we're going to see the amazing idea of the Vilna Gaon. What's the Ramban saying? That the Torah as we have it is something much deeper than what appears before us. That underlying the normative Torah with its narrative and commandments is this primeval mystical Torah, which is God's name. God's name. Not intelligible to us, at least not to me. That's for sure. What does that mean? I think that this mystical tradition is trying to say the following. When we know the name of somebody, we're able to connect with that person. There's another being out there. By knowing their name, I can reach out and touch them. I can create a certain relationship with that person. I know that when I teach, it's actually very frustrating when I teach over the internet because I don't really even see you. So I'm just talking to a screen. It's a kind of a bizarre experience. But even when I teach real people, I know you're real. But when I'm teaching live with people, live students in the same room, if I don't know their name, there's something very lacking in the learning experience. There's a kind of anonymity which robs the experience of a certain level of vitality. I'm not in intimate dialogue with the students. I don't even know their name. But at least if I know their name, and sometimes I'll ask a student, what's your name? And then I'll use their name when they speak up again. It changes, at least from my experience, the whole tenor of the dialogue. I can connect through the name. Now, at the same time, name is not necessarily essence. Name is a way we call somebody, which has a certain important relationship with that person, but I would not say it's identical with the essence of that person. Our relationship with God is analogous to this same dynamic. God, in his essence, is the holy other. And I mean that holy with both starting with an H and with a W. He's the holy other. According to the Rambam in his famous principle of negative attributes, there's nothing positive you can say about God. You can't say he's wise or he's tolerant or he's loving. Those are human attributes which cannot be attributed to God, who's utterly transcendent. You can only say what he isn't. God is not dumb. God is not cruel, etc. That technically speaking, that's the only way you can talk about God. Of course, we don't talk about God that. We talk about God in human terms. We talk about God in the way that the Torah expresses God's identity in the way he acts in the world. The Torah is God's name. The Torah provides a handle by which we can grab onto God, like when I'm drinking from a mug, like this. I'm holding onto the mug with the handle. And for those of you who date far back and remember there used to be a hobby, it probably still exists, of ham radio operators. Some of you may have done this in your lives. And people would have a name that they would use as a ham radio operator, and it's called your handle. Your handle. The name is the handle. The name is the way that you can hold something in your hand, that you can connect. The Torah is God's name. It's God allowing himself to be known to us. It's God allowing himself to be grabbed onto. Through our learning of the Torah and living of the Torah, we can have a vital relationship to God. The Torah is God's name. Embedded within the normative Torah is the mystical Torah, is God's name. We access God, we hold on to God. The Torah is God's handle. So explains the Rambam. Okay, now take a deep breath, everybody. We're going to see an amazing view of the Vilna Gaon. Now let's just review that there's a dispute about the last 8 verses. Rabbi Yehuda says Joshua wrote the last 8 verses. And on the other hand, Rabbi Shu Bar Yochai says, no, it cannot be. Or else it wouldn't be called the Sefer Torah, which was called in Moshe's own lifetime. It must be that Moshe wrote them. But he wrote them with tears. Fine. Along comes the Vilna Gaon and says, wrong. There is no dispute between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai about who wrote down the last 8 verses. They are in complete and utter agreement. You could have fooled me. We learned the Gemara ourselves. Rabbi Yehuda says Yehoshua wrote them. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai said Moshe wrote them with tears. Vilna Gaon says incorrect. Both views are indeed the words of the living God, and there's no dispute. And now he mentions something which Don had mentioned or alluded to. At first glance, that which was problematic to the Talmud about the last 8 verses, namely, how could they have been written if Moshe was still alive, is in fact not unique to that passage, since in fact the entire Torah was written 2,000 years before the creation of the world. If so, there was no heaven or earth and all their contents, nor the flood, nor the Tower of Babel, nor the Exodus, etc. How could they be written in the Torah before they were in the world at all? So the Vilna Gaon quotes this notion that's already found in the Talmud and is explored much by the kabbalistic literature. Istakel baraita ubara alma. God looked into the Torah and created the world. The Torah is the blueprint of the world. So the question of the Talmud is strange, because everything in the Torah is describing something which did not exist. So what's the problem about the last 8 verses? It's just like everything else in the Torah. The Torah is describing something that didn't exist. It came into being before the world. It's the blueprint of the world. So now the Vilna Gaon explains we have to understand on a deeper level what the Torah is, and he alludes to Ramban. He doesn't mention Ramban by name, but clearly it is the Ramban, as you'll see. But as is known, all the Torah is God's names by means of combinations of letters and words. Before creation, the Torah was with God in the form of combinations and hidden secrets. It was not readable as it is now, but just in the form of the names of God. So the Ramban is, the Vilna Gaon is alluding to the idea that's seen in the Ramban based on the Kabbalah. There was a primeval Torah, a primordial Torah, a mystical Torah, which was not decipherable. It wasn't in a form where we could understand the narrative in mitzvot. It was this mystical expression of the names of God. And as we explained, it's God's name. It's the way we access God, have a relationship with God's handle. After God created the world and gave the Torah to Israel and surrounded them with mitzvot, commandments, that need to be done within the boundaries of place and time. The primordial Torah is not actionable. What are you supposed to do with a string of letters which are not intelligible? We live in the real world, the concrete world of time and place. So the primordial Torah will not do us any good. So what happened? He wrote the Torah clearly, how to do the mitzvot, and he divided the Torah into words and letters to reveal and explain all of the words of the Torah. So there is the primeval Torah, but when the Torah was given at Mount Sinai, holiday of Shavuot coming up, so that Torah had to be translated. The primal Torah, the mystical Torah, had to be translated into the normative Torah of spaces between letters to create words and sentences in order to convey divine will and wisdom through the narrative and through the mitzvot. The secrets of the Torah, in accordance with the combinations, were given only to those who know the esoteric wisdom, which can only be made to the wise, which is the entire membership of Knesset Israel Torah Center. But other than that, we can only have the normative Torah and the primeval Torah, that is the mystical Torah, which existed before the world was created, which is God's name. That's the just for those who are on the level access the kabbalistic wisdom. Now watch what he does. He's going to return to the Talmud, and it's going to show you how there's no dispute between Rabbi Shimon, who said that Moshe wrote the last 8 verses while crying. You're going to see how the Vilna Gaon actually translates that differently. And Rabbi Yehuda, who says Joshua wrote the last 8 verses. No dispute. We can now explain the Talmud. Rabbi Shimon's intention was to avoid the Torah lacking even one letter. Right? The whole Torah had to exist in Moshe's lifetime, while not appearing as relating a falsehood. But at the same time, Moshe could not write, and Moshe died there. Moshe emet v'torato emet. Moshe is a man of truth, and the Torah is a Torah of truth. Moshe was not willing to write a sentence which conveyed a reality which is a lie. He could not possibly have written down the words, Vayamot Sham Moshe, and Moshe died there, because he didn't witness that event, and therefore he refused to write down those words. So what happened? For this reason, he says, at this point, the Holy One, blessed be he, spoke, and Moses spoke and wrote. Remember the repetition of the word spoke? According to the Ritva, means that Moses, out of his love for the Torah, repeated each verse and to not make a mistake. So Moses would speak it first to repeat it and then wrote it down. The Vilna Gaon says that is not what that means. When it says that God spoke and Moses spoke and wrote, it means the following: that Moshe spoke every word as is written for us in the normative Torah, meaning he translated it in a manner which conveys the commandments. But from here on, the last 8 verses, he could not write in an open manner. He refused to translate the primal Torah into the normative Torah. And Moshe died there. He refused to translate that, since it would appear as a falsehood. Let's just review. The Vilna Gaon is saying that according to Shum Bar Yochai, Moshe received the primal mystical Torah, which is without spaces. It's God's name. And Moshe then, Omer, he spoke, meaning he translated it into the normative Torah and then wrote down that normative Torah. But when it came to the verse, and Moshe died there, Moshe, who is a man of truth, refused to translate it. So what did he do? He wrote it down just in the mystical version, in a way which is not intelligible to the normal person. As well, Yehoshua could not finish the Torah. Now, it can't be that Yehoshua wrote down the last 8 verses, since the Torah cannot lack even one letter. It had to be the entire Torah existed with all its letters in the time of Moshe himself. For this reason, Rabbi Shimon explains that Moshe wrote a bidema. When it says that's the word for tears. That Moshe wrote those last 8 verses, he wrote a bidema. Now, everybody translates the word dema, tears. And it either means he wrote those last 8 verses while crying, or he wrote it instead of ink, he wrote it with the substrate of tears. The Vilna Gaon says the word bidema doesn't mean tears here. The word dema actually means mixed up or combined, and that's actually true. That Hebrew root, Dalet Mem Ayin, is found in Hebrew to mean not just tears, but it can mean something which is mixed up or combined. So Moshe wrote the last 8 verses, bidema, in the combined mystical manner. He wrote down the mystical Torah, the last 8 verses. He didn't translate it into the normative Torah. Let's read it. For this reason, Rabbi Shimon explains that Moshe wrote bidema, which actually means in a mixed up, combined manner. Since Moshe wrote from here on in the manner of the combinations, which are the original names of God, the mystical primeval Torah, so that it was not written at all as Moshe died there. It didn't say Moshe died there. It was written in a way which was mystical, right? No spaces, but other words in accordance with the secrets of the Torah. Now, what did Yehoshua do? After Moshe's death, Yehoshua rewrote them in the normative manner as he was allowed to reveal the Torah. So Yehoshua, when, according to Rabbi Yehuda, Yehoshua wrote the last 8 verses, that's true too. It's not that he wrote them where there was no verses at all. He took the mystical form of the last 8 verses, which Moshe wrote, who had refused to translate them into the normative Torah, because Moshe did not want to utter a falsehood describing his own death, which he, of course, didn't witness. So he left it. Moshe left it in the mystical primeval form. And then Yehoshua took those last 8 verses and he rewrote them. He translated them into the normative version, which said that Moshe died there, etc., which, of course, that was accurate because Yehoshua then is doing that translation, last 8 verses, after Moshe had in fact died. Accordingly, the 2 opinions do not conflict, for in truth, Moshe wrote them all. He wrote all of the Torah, including the last 8 verses. Not even one letter was missing. Yet when Moshe wrote the last 8 verses, he could not write them in the revealed normative form. And he wrote them according to the mystical combination. The last 8 verses left them in the mystical form. Hence, bedema, not in tears, but in a mixture form, in a combination form, the mystical combination. Yehoshua wrote according to the revealed form, as explained by Rabbi Yehuda, meaning he took the mystical form and he translated into the normative form. Hence, both views are in accord, for they were written by both. Moshe wrote the hidden secret form, and Yehoshua wrote the revealed form, the normative form, as is the form we possess for all generations. So explains the brilliant Vilna Gaon, where he interprets the Talmud in a way utterly different than the centuries of Talmudic scholarship that came before him, and offering this totally different explanation of the word bedema with tears. It doesn't mean with tears, it means in a mystical combination, and shows you that Rabbi Shimon, Bar Yochai, and Rabbi Yehuda were in fact describing different steps of the process. That Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is describing Moshe's contribution. All of the Torah translated into normative fashion, except for the last 8 verses, left in mystical fashion. And Rabbi Yehuda then contributing that Yehoshua then translated those last 8 psukim from the primordial mystical Torah to the normative Torah. And this really profound, amazing explanation of the Talmud is something perhaps to bear in mind when we learn Torah. When we learn Torah, that it's in a form that are stories and mitzvot. And we struggle with understanding the stories, and we struggle with understanding the mitzvot and living in accordance with the Torah. We need to be reminded every once in a while, and the Vilna Gaon has supplied us with that opportunity to appreciate that lurking beneath the surface of this Torah, with all of the struggles involved in understanding the narrative and the mitzvot, there lies in fact something even deeper. The Torah is the way that God has made himself available, that God has provided a handle, a name by which we can grab onto him. And through a life of study of Torah and living of Torah, that we can have a relationship of intimacy with the creator of existence. And with that, I wish you a wonderful Lag BaOmer.
Thank you.
Yes,
You're most welcome.
Somebody's email.
So